Hey everybody, in this video, I'm going to answer a few short questions that I've noticed in comments on YouTube and Instagram. The first one is the person asked, do all narcissists write with bad punctuation? She had seen that video that I did 2 years ago where I showed the text messages from someone. And she noticed that they were like leaving spaces between, let's say, the end of the sentence and the exclamation point or the comma. They were misspelled things. They were using shortened versions of words. So like in English, people would write the letter U instead of writing Y-O-U, or any of those kinds of abbreviations. So no, I don't think this is necessarily a sign of a narcissist or another abuser or manipulator. I still would urge you caution when you see that kind of stuff. She had also asked, wouldn't this be a great screening method nowadays when often we're meeting people and the very first exchanges are via text messages? So here's what I would encourage. I would encourage you to have standards around that, because someone who writes like a teenager is probably an immature person, okay? If they're in their 20s, 30s, 40s, and beyond, and they're writing like a teenager, that's not a good sign of maturity. Number two, maybe when you met that person, they were actually writing in full normal words and sentences, and then at some point along the line, all of a sudden, they started shortening those words. They started using all those teenager-like abbreviations. I would encourage you to look at that from a point of self-worth and having standards around, if that person can't take the few seconds longer that it takes to actually type out whole entire words to you, that probably means that person is telling you at some level that you're not worthy of that time, those few seconds extra that it takes. That's not a good sign. If you see that sort of thing, I would definitely flag that. Again, not necessarily a narcissist or an abuser, but quite likely someone immature and or someone who doesn't really see your worth. So I would encourage you to focus on your worth instead. It is so important to know your value and also know your values, like what most matters to you, what's important to you, so that you can set up standards around those values to help you honor those values, and then to set up boundaries around those standards so that you can protect what really matters to you, so you can protect your self-worth. Every time you get challenged and you set a new boundary, you raise your self-worth. That's how you get your self-worth back. So if you want to know more about that, check out a recent course that I just added to the website. It's called Raising Your Self-Worth, and it was actually a class from the Mental Ninja Mastery. The second question I want to answer is, the person asked, how long does the love bombing last on average, and what do we have to do to be devalued? So I'm not sure if she was trying to get devalued or if she meant more like, what is it that we do that then leads to the devaluation? So the thing is, it really depends if you are the long-term supply or the short-term supply, more of a temporary supply. You're not necessarily the person that determines that. That's usually more the abuser will assign you that role based on their current levels of supply. So if they just lost their long-term supply, they're now on the market for another long-term supply replacement. That's a primary supply source. That's the person that they are going to cultivate for the long con, which means they're going to put a lot more effort of investment into that initial love bombing phase because they're seeing the long game there. Whereas if they just see you as a temporary supply, what's going to happen is they're going to invest a lot less at the beginning. There'll be a lot less overall energetic investment in the love bombing, and also less of a period of time of investment in the love bombing. And why does it shift? Where is that point? Well, for both the long-term and the temporary supply source, that shift suddenly happens from love bombing to devaluation when you set a boundary. You either call something out as unacceptable, as not okay, or you flat out set out a boundary and say no. You don't give them what it is that they want because it's not okay for you. You've decided that that goes against your standards, that goes against your values, so you protect those with the boundary. that's not convenient for an abusive person. So that's usually where you're going to see that sudden shift into the devaluation. And remember, up until this point, that abusive person, everything they do is constantly measuring how accommodating you are, how willing you are to please them, what your level of boundaries are like, what your level of self-worth is like. And they can tell that based on how they treat you. So maybe like the first neg or like that first thing that they do to put you down is really subtle. And maybe you don't notice it, or you go along with it, or you give it the plausible deniability, which especially in the covert form is so easy to do. And so then eventually they start increasing the intensity, the escalation of those little tests. And what you're going to see is that it gets bigger and bigger. And so they're just going to keep pushing until you push back. So if they realize they can just push and push and push, and they can continually treat you worse and worse, and that's not always with what they're doing, that could be with what they're not doing, like not following up on a date that you have, or flaking at the last minute, or ignoring you, or things like this. So what you'll notice is those devaluation things start to increase until that point where they hit the wall of your boundaries. That's where they're able to gauge your current level of self-worth. And obviously abusers are looking for the easiest target as possible, and that would be the person with the lowest amount of self-worth. Now, don't beat yourself up if you didn't have self-worth, because that probably came from prior abusive situations. Maybe you were raised in a family where these patterns were the normal. One or both of your parents was some sort of abusive or manipulative person, and they whittled away at your self-worth. I think a child is born, comes into this world feeling worthy, feeling dignified, feeling enough. And it's the parent or the caretaker that teaches that child otherwise. So if you were stripped of that worthiness since you were a child, of course you're going to fall into adult abusive relationships, because that's what looks normal to you, and your current level of self-worth is lower. Maybe you had self-worth in the past. Maybe then you met an abusive person, they took you down in self-worth, or maybe you had some kind of crazy experience at work where you just lost your self-worth. Something happened where you just no longer believed in yourself. And then right on the heels of that, you got into an abusive relationship. So it could be multiple different factors that are involved, but the point is you want to work on your self-worth. That's one of those 4 pillars of recovery after narcissistic abuse. I did a video on that a couple years ago. I'll put that link up here for you if you want to check that out. Rebuilding that self-worth is so important. It's like narc repellent. It will repel abusive and manipulative people. And that can be from day one. That can be, you go to a new job, you meet a new friend, you go on date 1, and that person who might be a manipulator and abuser immediately senses your level of self-worth. When they start with those little subtle things and they realize you're not going to be an easy target, so they're not going to bother with you. They're not really going to give you much time of day because they're not interested in that. And that's good for you. That's the kind of rejection that you want to get. So to wrap up that question, the amount of time on average, there really is no time average. That depends if your short-term temporary supply, if your long-term supply, where your level of self-worth is, how your boundaries are. It's going to vary based on that. There really is no number that I could give you. The next question I want to answer is, and I've seen this many times, so I hope this helps a lot of you. What do I do with a narcissistic child? That is a really, really tough one. So what's most important is you need to get your power back right away. If you've given your power away to your child, whether that's an actual underage child or it's an adult child at this point, you need to get your power back. How do you do that? You start setting boundaries, you create consequences for those boundaries, and you follow through. So setting a boundary and then not enforcing a consequence is not following through. That continues to teach your child that they can walk all over you, that your boundaries don't mean anything, that you don't feel your boundaries are worthy, that you're just going to say those sorts of things, but they can walk all over you and do what they want anyways. Be sure there are consequences. Make that clear ahead of time so that you offer that child the opportunity for success. this is the consequence for that action or that inaction. If it's something that you need them to do that they're not following through, picking up their room, cleaning up something, getting to bed, whatever that is. So make sure that you're following through. That's how you're going to get your power back. You're also going to want to apply the respond versus react technique. So that's just like you would do with your ex, with the other parent of that child, the one that they learned those behaviors from. You're going to need to do that gray rock technique so that you stop reacting to them, so that they stop getting that energetic and emotional supply from you by getting an emotional reaction for you. I can only imagine how hard that's got to be when it's your kid, right? So you got to work on that. If you don't know what that is or you want to review that, I have some videos on that topic. I also have a podcast episode on that topic that kind of goes more into depth, and it's a more recent version of how I wanted to explain respond versus react. Now, what if those are actual children, underage children? I had talked to a therapist, Bree Bonche. She's the one that runs the World Narcissistic Abuse Awareness Day every year on June 1st. A client had asked this question, and I asked her what she would recommend, and she said, in America, what it's called is neuropsych testing, neuropsychological testing. I don't know what that's called in other countries. There must be some kind of equivalent. What that means is you need to find a specialist who does that, some kind of psychologist who specializes in neuropsych testing for children, and get your kid tested. She said, I would find a way to get the money to get that testing done. Because when you get the testing done, she said, then that gives you an idea of maybe there's a diagnosis, or at the very least, they're going to recommend a certain treatment plan. So that gives you some options on what to do. And then again, if your children are young enough, if they're still in school, then maybe that qualifies them for an IEP. That's an individualized educational program, I think it's called. That's, of course, in America. So I don't know what that's called in your country. If you live in a different country, I imagine there's something like that. What that means is maybe then your child is eligible for some extra resources at school, some extra help at school, and then also the teachers are notified that your child is having those issues. So once you get the testing done, then you can get them into treatment. I would get them, if I were a parent, I would get my kid into treatment as soon as possible, because the younger you intervene, the greater chance you have of turning that child around before they become an adult and develop a full-on personality disorder where there's no more changing at that point. When they're younger, they're still more malleable. You still have a lot more opportunity to intervene and get them help if you can find the right resources. Now, if you're talking about an adult child, this person is over 18 years old, they're your child, they're a grown-ass adult. So at this point, you got to start giving them the responsibility of being an adult. And that means you're no longer responsible for them. So that means if your child, an adult child, is abusing you, you have every right to go no contact with them. Maybe you're involved something with school. Maybe you're paying for their university and stuff, and I don't know how that works. And if there's any legal obligations there, I don't know about that. You probably need to talk to an attorney about that. But if this is just about you deciding whether or not you want to have a relationship with your adult child or how to manage that, you get to decide that. You get to decide if you want to go no contact. I can only imagine how difficult that is if it's your child. And at a certain point, you've got to value, your sense of self-worth, your health, your sanity, your well-being, just like you would if that were any other person in your life, versus maintaining this relationship that's destroying you. So I imagine that's a very difficult decision, but when they are an adult, you have different options. When they're a child, an underage child, you're still responsible for them. And at that point, if I were you, I would do everything possible to get them help so that you could possibly give them that opportunity to turn things around. Now, you can't force them. If they don't make any effort to change, if they continue on with those toxic, manipulative behaviors, that's their choice. And unfortunately, you are responsible for them. If they get into trouble, you could get into trouble. So you really want to be careful. Make sure that you're checking all legal resources possible. Make sure you know your rights and your responsibilities as the parent, and try to get them help if possible. The final piece of advice I have on that question is remember that your kids, whether children or adults, but especially children, they're going to learn a lot more based on what you do than on what you say. So if you're telling them things about how to behave like a healthy human being, but you're not putting that into practice, and that doesn't necessarily mean that you're the manipulator. You might not be. You might be a codependent. And if you're modeling that behavior to them and they see that it's easy to walk all over you because you're not going to set boundaries, or you're going to say you're going to set boundaries, but then you're not going to follow through on the consequences, or they see you people pleasing and they realize it's just really easy because as long as they can twist your mind into pleasing them and wanting them to like you, then they can walk all over you, that sort of thing. So you need to be really clear, make sure you're practicing what you're preaching, because your kids are going to learn a lot more from your actions than from the words, any words that you tell them. And finally, the last question that I want to address, I keep hearing this from people, I keep getting messages, do I do sessions? Not anymore. I used to do coaching sessions until the end of 2018. I no longer work one-on-one. There were just too many people. My schedule was booking a month in advance. It was unfortunate for the clients who wanted to talk to me sooner. It was stressful for me because then I couldn't get sick or have an internet issue or anything like that. Nowadays, I'm working in a group model, so once a month. It's called the Mental Ninja Mastery. That also comes with a community forum just for people who are in that group. So you can find out information about that on the website. If you are looking for a licensed psychotherapist in your area, I've been recommending people to BetterHelp. You'll find the link here below the video, BetterHelp/inner integration, which will take you to their intake form. That intake form will ask you a bunch of questions about where you're at right now, what you're looking for. There's a specific question that asks you what you want to work on. One of those boxes is trauma and abuse. So if you want help dealing with narcissistic abuse, dealing with the aftermath of the abuse, be sure to tick that box, because that's going to match you up with a therapist who specializes in that area. So I've been hearing from people that they're really loving that service. It's an online portal, so you can even chat with a therapist, you can call with a therapist, you can do an online session. It's really convenient nowadays that everyone is so busy and they're dealing with traffic and commuting and just extremely busy lives. So check that out if that interests you and if you're looking for a licensed therapist in your area. So I hope these questions and answers were helpful for you. If they were, let me know in the comments below. Give the video a like. If you want to hear more of these kinds of videos where I answer your questions, little questions that I take from comments on YouTube or on Instagram, let me know as well, because then we can see a lot more of that. I'm sending you a big hug.